The wedding united our families until I learned what my wife did behind closed doors. Daniel Foster had always believed that weddings revealed who people really were, not because of the vows or the speeches, but because pressure stripped away habits and left only priorities. The wedding that was supposed to unite their families felt perfect on the surface, exactly the kind of event his wife, Laura, excelled at navigating with practiced warmth and precise smiles. They had 2 children, 11-year-old Sophie and 8-year-old Miles, both dressed in outfits Laura had chosen weeks in advance, reminding Daniel more than once how important it was that everything look right, that no one noticed cracks that weren't theirs to see. Laura moved through the venue with ease, greeting relatives, laughing at familiar jokes, guiding Sophie away from the cake table before dinner without ever raising her voice. Daniel watched her from a distance, not suspicious yet, just aware of how little she checked in with him compared to how often she disappeared into side corridors with family members he didn't recognize well. The groom was Laura's cousin Mark, someone Daniel had known casually for years, polite, charming, and always careful about boundaries, or at least that's how Daniel remembered him. During the ceremony, Laura held Daniel's hand firmly, squeezing a little harder than usual during the vows, as if anchoring herself, and Daniel assumed it was emotion. The children leaned against them, Sophie whispering questions about when dinner would start, Miles tugging at Daniel's sleeve asking if he could play with the other kids near the back. Everything felt loud and orderly at the same time. At the reception, Laura insisted Daniel stay with the kids while she checked on a few things, and he agreed without hesitation, guiding Miles away from the DJ booth and helping Sophie find the bathroom. When Laura returned, her hair was slightly out of place, her lipstick reapplied carefully, and she avoided Daniel's eyes while asking if the kids were hungry. Daniel brushed it off as wedding chaos, the kind everyone joked about afterward. As the evening wore on, Daniel noticed patterns he hadn't expected to notice at all. Laura leaving her phone face down on the table, Mark disappearing from his own reception for stretches of time, Laura's sister covering for her absence by redirecting conversations whenever someone asked where Laura had gone. Sophie noticed it too, tugging on Daniel's jacket and asking why Mom kept leaving during the party, why she wasn't in any of the group photos near the dance floor. Daniel told her Mom was helping family, but the explanation sounded thinner the more often he repeated it. Later, while the kids were distracted by sparklers outside, Daniel went looking for Laura to tell her it was time to gather for the final photos. He walked past the storage rooms and quiet hallways the staff used, calling her name softly so he wouldn't draw attention. He heard laughter first, low and familiar, and then voices that stopped abruptly when his footsteps echoed close. The door at the end of the hall was ajar, just enough for light to spill into the corridor. Daniel paused, not because he expected anything, but because something in his chest tightened without explanation. When he pushed the door open, he saw Laura standing too close to Mark, her hand still resting on his arm, his posture angled toward her in a way that had nothing to do with celebration. They didn't jump apart immediately. They froze, like people caught mid-decision rather than mid-conversation. Laura spoke first, too quickly, saying Mark was overwhelmed and needed a moment away from the noise, saying she was just calming him down before he returned to his guests. Mark nodded, adding something about family stress, about needing privacy for a minute. Daniel listened, noticing how Laura stepped slightly in front of Mark as if shielding him, how she touched Daniel's arm not to reassure him, but to guide him out of the room. Daniel didn't argue. He nodded, said he'd take the kids home soon since it was late, and left them there without another word. In the car, Sophie asked why Mom wasn't coming with them and whether she'd missed something important. Daniel told her Mom would be along later. Miles fell asleep before they reached home, his head heavy on Daniel's shoulder, trusting the world the way children still could. Daniel tucked them into bed alone, answered their questions carefully, and sat at the kitchen table afterwards staring at the invitation still propped against a vase of leftover flowers. His phone buzzed with a message from Laura saying she'd stay longer to help clean up and would explain everything tomorrow. Daniel didn't reply. Instead, He opened the photo gallery on the shared family cloud, scrolling through images guests had already uploaded from the reception. Smiling faces, raised glasses, moments frozen in celebration, until one photo stopped him cold. It was taken in the background of the venue, slightly out of focus, showing Laura and Mark standing close in that same hallway, her hand on his arm, his face turned toward hers in a way that no wedding explanation could soften. Daniel stared at the screen long enough to feel the shift settle in, realizing that whatever he thought he'd walked in on earlier hadn't been the beginning, and that the wedding hadn't united their families at all. It had simply given Laura the perfect place to hide something that was already happening. Daniel didn't sleep more than an hour, not because his thoughts were racing, but because every time he closed his eyes, the hallway photo reappeared with a clarity that made explanations feel childish. At breakfast, he kept things ordinary, packing lunches, checking Sophie's spelling list, tying Miles's shoes, while Laura's empty chair sat where it always did. When Laura finally came home mid-morning, she moved through the house quietly, setting her keys down with care, watching Daniel's face as if it might tip her off about how much he knew. She started talking before he asked anything, explaining the late night as cleanup, as family obligations that couldn't wait, as the price of keeping peace when weddings brought out old tensions. Daniel listened and nodded, not to agree but to let her finish, and noticed how often she mentioned everyone else's expectations and how rarely she mentioned their children. Sophie wandered in and asked if the wedding was over forever now, and Laura answered to brightly that weddings ended but families stayed, smoothing Sophie's hair in a way that felt performative rather than present. Daniel watched Sophie accept the touch and then pull away a moment later, already recalibrating. After school drop-off, Daniel drove past the venue again, not to investigate, but to ground himself in the fact that it had happened in a real place with real corners and doors, not in his imagination. His phone buzzed with messages from relatives praising the wedding, thanking Laura for being so helpful, commenting on how lucky Mark's partner was to have such supportive family. Daniel replied politely to none of it. By afternoon, Laura asked if they could talk after the kids went to bed, framing it as a chance to clear the air before rumors started, and Daniel agreed, setting a boundary without naming it. That evening, when Sophie asked why Mom kept checking her phone during dinner, Laura laughed and said adults had boring things to handle, and Daniel saw Sophie's eyes drift to the hallway where the photo had been taken, as if children remembered places adults wished they wouldn't. When the kids were asleep, Daniel laid the phone on the table and slid it toward Laura without commentary. She picked it up, saw the photo, and went still in a way that made the room feel smaller. She didn't deny it. She recontextualized it, talking about comfort, about timing, about how Mark was under pressure and how families leaned on each other in moments like that. Daniel asked when leaning turned into hiding, and Laura answered by warning him not to jump to conclusions that would embarrass everyone, not to say anything before Mark's partner recovered from the stress of the day, not to put Sophie and Miles in the middle of adult misunderstandings. The words came out practiced, and Daniel recognized the shift from explanation to management. He asked how long it had been happening, and Laura avoided the number by listing reasons. He told her he'd seen more than one photo, and she stopped talking altogether, calculating the size of the hole rather than how to climb out of it. The next morning, Daniel received a call from Laura's sister asking him to be patient, reminding him how public the wedding had been and how quickly stories grew teeth, suggesting they all take a breath and protect the kids from unnecessary disruption. Daniel thanked her and hung up, realizing the family had already chosen quiet over clarity. At school pickup, a parent he barely knew mentioned how impressive Laura had been at the wedding, and Daniel felt the distance between praise and truth widen into something dangerous. That night, Daniel checked the cloud again and found new uploads, candid shots taken by guests who didn't know what they were capturing, Laura slipping down the same hallway twice, Mark's partner scanning the room with a smile that looked practiced from far away, a timestamp that overlapped with Laura's absence at the table. Daniel saved the files, not to punish, but to anchor reality before it got negotiated out of existence. He printed one image and folded it into his jacket pocket, deciding he would speak to a lawyer in the morning, not to threaten, but to understand how quickly control shifted when silence was mistaken for consent. As he turned off the light, his phone vibrated with a new message from an unknown number that included a single line and no greeting, saying they needed to talk before things got complicated. And when Daniel opened the preview, he recognized Mark's name attached to it. Realizing the next move wasn't Laura's to make any more, Daniel met the lawyer the next morning in a small office that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Not because he was ready to file anything, but because he needed to understand how fast a story could be rewritten once enough people agreed on a version that felt comfortable. He spoke in dates and places rather than conclusions, mentioned the wedding, the hallway, the photos, the cloud uploads, the late returns home that didn't line up with family needs. The lawyer asked practical questions about finances, schedules, who handled school mornings, who attended appointments, and Daniel realized how much of his life had been built on showing up quietly without documenting it. He left with a list and a warning that silence often got interpreted as agreement once families closed ranks. On the drive home, he didn't call Laura. He stopped at the school instead and volunteered to chaperone an after-hours rehearsal Sophie had forgotten to mention. Watching her scan the room when other parents arrived with their partners, noticing how she angled her body toward him as if claiming a side without being asked, Laura arrived late, standing in the doorway for a moment before joining them, greeting the director too loudly, hugging Sophie too tightly, and telling Daniel they needed to talk privately. He said later, she didn't push, but her jaw tightened in a way he hadn't seen before. That evening, Laura's parents came by unannounced, bringing leftovers from the wedding and a tone that suggested reconciliation had already been agreed upon somewhere else. They talked about how emotions ran high during celebrations, how people misread closeness, how important it was to keep children shielded from adult missteps, and Daniel noticed how none of it required Laura to say anything at all. When he mentioned the photo, Laura's mother said pictures lied when taken out of context, and Laura's father asked whether Daniel really wanted to be the person who turned a family milestone into a scandal. Daniel said he wanted the truth to stop moving depending on who was in the room. The visit ended politely and coldly. Later, Daniel found Sophie sitting on the stairs with her knees pulled in, asking if everyone was mad at them now because of the wedding. He told her no one was mad at her or Miles, and asked what made her think that. She said people kept whispering when Mom walked away and that she saw Mark leave the house earlier with his head down. Daniel didn't correct her observations. He thanked her for telling him. The next day, Laura asked to take the kids to lunch with Mark's partner, framing it as reassurance, a way to keep things normal. Daniel said no and offered to take them himself. Laura accused him of being controlling and then pivoted to how this would look to others if he blocked contact. Daniel asked when contact started needing permission. That night, Daniel received another message from Mark asking to meet, promising clarity if Daniel would hear him out without making things public. Daniel agreed to meet in a crowded cafe, choosing visibility over comfort. Mark arrived looking tired, speaking quickly, saying boundaries had blurred during wedding prep, that Laura had been supportive when he felt overwhelmed, that nothing had crossed a line until after the ceremony, then corrected himself and said not crossed so much as misinterpreted. Daniel asked when Mark planned to tell his partner. Mark said timing mattered and asked Daniel to keep this contained for the sake of everyone involved. Daniel told him containment was the problem. When Daniel returned home, Laura was waiting, phone in hand, saying Mark had told her about the meeting and that they needed to coordinate before this spiraled. Daniel said coordination sounded like planning, and Laura's expression hardened. She said if he forced this into the open, people would choose sides, schools would ask questions, lawyers would get involved, and the kids would feel it first. Daniel asked why protecting the kids suddenly meant protecting lies. Laura didn't answer. She said he was making this harder than it needed to be. The following afternoon, a notification appeared on Daniel's phone from the family cloud, a video upload he hadn't seen before. Time-stamped during the reception, taken by a guest who didn't know what they were recording. Daniel opened it and watched Laura and Mark enter the same hallway together, heard a door close, and then saw them reappear minutes later adjusting clothes and scanning the corridor. Daniel saved the file and shut the phone off as Laura's name lit the screen with an incoming call. Realizing the next decision would determine whether this stayed a managed secret or became something no one could fold back into celebration, Daniel didn't answer Laura's call right away. Not because he wanted to punish her, but because he needed the silence to stay intact long enough to think without interference. He picked Sophie up from rehearsal, listened as she talked about costumes and lighting, and noticed how she skipped mentioning Mom entirely, as if the subject had become unstable ground she preferred to avoid. Miles asked whether they were still going to Aunt Carol's barbecue on Sunday, and Daniel said they would see, already aware that every social event had quietly turned into a referendum. When they got home, Laura was waiting in the living room, posture straight, hands folded, her phone placed face down on the table as if to demonstrate restraint. She spoke first, saying Mark was panicking, saying his partner suspected something, and that the family needed to move carefully before things exploded in ways no one could control. Daniel asked why control mattered more than honesty, and Laura replied that honesty didn't exist in isolation, that it had consequences, that children paid for adult righteousness more than adults ever did. Daniel told her he had seen the video. She went still, then reached for the phone as if to check whether it had been sent anywhere else. She asked where he got it, who else had it, how many copies existed, her mind already skipping past denial and landing on damage assessment. Daniel said it was uploaded by a guest and that he'd saved it. Laura's voice dropped, warning him that releasing it would destroy Mark's partner, fracture the family, and turn Sophie and Miles into the children everyone whispered about at school. She said if he cared about them, he would keep this private and let things settle. Daniel asked how long settling would take and what exactly would settle besides other people's discomfort. The argument was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mark's partner stood outside, eyes red, jaw tight, holding a phone with the video paused mid-frame. She said she'd been sent the clip anonymously and asked if Daniel knew what she was looking at. Laura tried to step forward, but Daniel answered first, saying yes, he knew, and that he was sorry she'd had to find out this way. The room filled with a silence that felt heavier than shouting. Mark's partner asked Laura if it was true. Laura didn't deny it. She explained it, talking about moments, confusion, how things happened without intention, and Daniel watched the words land badly, watched them fail to build a bridge where a foundation had collapsed. Mark's partner left without another word, and Laura turned on Daniel, accusing him of orchestrating the confrontation, of forcing exposure, of choosing chaos. Daniel said he hadn't chosen anything, he just stopped preventing the truth from reaching people who deserved it. That night, Laura packed a bag and said she'd stay with her parents until Daniel calmed down, adding that lawyers would get involved if he continued to behave unpredictably. Daniel didn't stop her. He focused on the kids, explaining that Mom needed a few days away and that none of this was their fault, answering questions without editorializing. After they were asleep, his phone filled with messages from relatives urging discretion, warning about reputations, asking him to think about the wedding photos that would live online forever. One message stood out from an unfamiliar number asking if Daniel would be willing to share the video formally, saying it was needed for legal reasons, and when Daniel traced the number, he realized it belonged to Mark's partner's attorney. He stared at the screen, understanding that the story had moved beyond family pressure and into a space where choices would be recorded, consequences would be enforced, and silence would no longer protect anyone. The legal process unfolded faster than Daniel expected, not because anyone wanted resolution, but because once the video existed, delay stopped serving the people who had relied on it most. Statements were taken, timelines compared, messages subpoenaed, and Daniel watched from a strange distance. Moments he had lived quietly returned into entries on paper that didn't care who felt embarrassed by them. Laura's parents shifted from urging discretion to urging strategy, advising her to emphasize confusion, emotional overlap, and shared responsibility, anything that might soften intent into accident. Laura followed the advice imperfectly, alternating between insisting nothing truly happened and admitting just enough to explain why everyone else was overreacting, and that inconsistency did more damage than any single admission could have. Mark disappeared from the narrative almost entirely, resigning from his job, avoiding family gatherings, and communicating only through counsel, while his partner pursued annulment with a calm determination that didn't require theatrics. Daniel focused on the children, maintaining schedules, attending school meetings, explaining changes without assigning blame, and noticing how Sophie asked fewer questions but listened more closely, while Miles began reminding Daniel of pickup times as if anchoring himself to certainty where adults had failed him. When the custody hearing arrived, the courtroom was quieter than Daniel had imagined. Laura presented herself a devoted mother caught in an unfortunate sequence of misunderstandings, supported by relatives who spoke about appearances and community standing. Daniel didn't contradict their feelings, he contradicted their facts, presenting evidence that showed planning rather than confusion, concealment rather than accident, and the judge listened with a patience that suggested familiarity with stories that tried to outrun documentation. The ruling prioritized stability, granting shared custody with clear boundaries and reducing the flexibility Laura had used to manage perception. And when the judge emphasized the children's need for consistency over adult comfort, Daniel felt something inside him settle. Outside the courthouse, Laura accused Daniel of turning a family celebration into a permanent fracture, saying people would remember this wedding for all the wrong reasons. And Daniel replied that people remembered what they were shown. In the months that followed, the social noise faded into something manageable. Invitations became selective, conversations careful, but the kids found their footing in routines that no longer shifted with someone else's secrets. Sophie began inviting friends over again, explaining the family situation in simple terms without shame, while Miles stopped asking whether adults were mad and started asking about plans instead. Daniel learned that the moral he carried forward wasn't about punishment or victory, but about refusing to trade his children's sense of reality for the comfort of adults who preferred silence. The wedding that had promised unity had instead revealed fault lines everyone had agreed not to see, and once exposed, those lines couldn't be smoothed over with smiles or speeches. Daniel didn't feel relief so much as clarity. Understanding that truth, once allowed into the open, demanded responsibility rather than reaction, and that choosing it, even when it fractured appearances, gave his children something sturdier than reputation to stand on. ****